Thanks for the invitation to be here. It's really exciting to be part of such an interdisciplinary meeting. Brian and I were reminiscing a little bit before about kind of some of the first meetings in the open science research transparency space in the social sciences, and what a revelation it was for us to meet colleagues across fields who shared interests. And really in just 6 or 7 years, so much has changed. Some of what I'll talk about today will really relate to that. So it's just exciting to see what the movement has become with so many high-quality talks across fields. Some of what I'll be discussing today is based on a new book that just came out about a month ago with University of California Press. We actually have some copies on hand here today. So if you send me an email, we have I think like 10 or 15 copies. We'll have them for you in the lobby later on. This has been the product of the kind of interdisciplinary collaboration that I think meetings like this foster. One of my co-authors on this book is Jeremy Fries, who's a sociologist here at Stanford, whom I met actually at a meeting organized by the Center for Open Science. And the other colleague is Garrett Christensen, who's an economist at the Census Bureau. There's been a lot of discussion earlier today about the importance of teaching the next generation, training the next generation in these ideas, these approaches, achieving some sort of cultural change in our fields. And the book is really designed to teach a lot of the topics we've been talking about here at a graduate level, or maybe even an advanced undergraduate level. So we cover lots of topics that were on the agenda. I'm not going to go through them, but yeah, we'd be delighted to talk more about it and see if there's some connection with your teaching, or maybe even colleagues could benefit from having this kind of reference. There's also online lectures. We organized a MOOC around the book through FutureLearn, and a lot of lectures related to the book on the BITS website, Berkeley Initiative for Transparency in the Social Sciences. So a little bit of a plug, but also a lot of what I'll be talking about today draws on material in the book. So what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the story of research transparency and open science and metascience in economics, my field, and how I see it fitting into some of our discussions earlier today about other fields. There have been a number of moves in economics over the last few decades towards, I think, objectively, more research rigor. There were big changes in the way we do statistical work through the adoption of methods that allow us to make causal claims with more confidence, experimental work, quasi-experimental methods. And people in economics call this the credibility revolution in economics. That really made empirical analysis a lot more rigorous and believable than it was before. I see the move towards open science and research transparency as a logical next step in that progression towards rigor, towards credibility. Beyond the direct benefits for research quality, these values of openness and transparency, I think, also resonate very deeply with our goals, or for most of us as scientists, as researchers. And the scientific ethos, if you read classic accounts like Merton's in 1942, the scientific ethos is really fundamentally about openness. So I think there's really a normative perspective in addition to the value that these methods may hold for improving the quality of our research. There's a large body of evidence that I'm not going to spend time on today documenting all the problems in our fields. There's been issues of fraud that have been high profile, publication bias, failure to replicate. In the publication bias discussions in field after field, we find very few published null results. And this is something that's been known for a long time, but really indicates that publication bias could be quite severe. And again, I won't go through that evidence today, but I think everybody here is familiar with that kind of work. Where I see the frontier of metascience right now, and why this meeting yesterday, today, tomorrow is so exciting, is we're really shifting into a new phase in the metascience movement, away from just rigorously documenting the problems that exist or trying to let our colleagues know that these problems exist, towards moving towards really concrete, actionable solutions. And I think over the last few years, we've seen this trend in metascience accelerate, where now we can talk about evidence on the impact of particular processes and reforms. What I'm going to do today, and just in a limited amount of time, is talk about three changes, reforms, processes, mainly with a focus on economics. I'm going to talk about journal policies. I'm going to talk about the rise of registration and pre-results review. And then I'll present some new evidence, some new unpublished data on trends in open science attitudes and practices actually across the social sciences. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of where I see things going, which is part of this broader trend towards solutions and impact, not just documenting problems. So the first thing I want to talk about is two particular cases of journal policies that have been quite influential in, or that appear to be quite influential in economics. Now, there's a lot of reasons to think journal policies matter a lot. For those of us who are active researchers, we have to publish. We publish typically in journals. So journal policies can just be an incredibly effective lever at changing behavior. And let me talk about the first policy. The first policy I'm going to discuss is a very light touch policy, but there's some new evidence that it had some interesting impacts. So several years ago, a number of journals in the field of health economics, the editors got together and decided to release an editorial statement affirming the importance of publishing null results and affirming this value of research even if you don't have statistically significant results. Basically, research should be judged on its quality, the importance of the question, not just on the p-value. And you can see some of the language that was used. The editors then included a statement to this effect to all referees who were reviewing papers. So pretty light touch intervention, but the hope was to signal that there was a regime change, that now null results were welcome and we should be judging research on quality, not just on whether the p is less than 0.05. There's some new evidence by Blanco Perez and Brodeur that's forthcoming in the Economic Journal, it's called EJ, on the effect of this policy. Now, this analysis, the authors actually pre-registered before they had collected their data. It's a pretty straightforward analysis. They look at changes in the proportion of null results published over time in these 8 health economics journals versus 2 comparison journals that they pre-specified that publish very similar types of papers but weren't included in this group of health economics journals. They were mainly public economics and labor economics papers, so kind of similar style work. This is the data that they present in their paper. There's 2 lines here, 2 plots over time. The light gray are these comparison journals that didn't change editorial practices. It was sort of status quo practices. You can see here, if you look at the vertical axis, that about 55% of papers published in these journals had significant results for their main, what was thought to be their main test, main hypothesis. Pretty stable over time. There was really no change. And then you have the dark gray line there with the T. These were the journals that participated in this editorial statement together with the letters going out to referees every time they saw a paper. Here you can see that before the policy change, about, again, 50% of papers had significant results. But once the policy was implemented, there was a pretty sharp drop in the proportion of significant results, meaning a lot more results published in the journal were null results pretty quickly, basically within a year or 2. Now, this isn't the perfect experimental research design. There's only 10 journals. We can talk about caveats of this kind of the design, but it was pre-specified, and it's quite suggestive that some editorial practices can be quite influential. So I think that's a hopeful sign. And one of the themes in my talk today is I'm going to, instead of focusing on the problems, I'm going to talk about a bunch of hopeful moves and progress in a couple of different dimensions. So it looks like editorial practices pretty quickly can let us see a lot more null results with a lot of benefits for our published literatures. So that's one change. Another big change, a recent change in economics, is a new policy that was just announced, again in July, by the American Economic Association, the sort of largest professional association of economists in the country, probably the most influential in the world. The AEA put out a new data policy which will apply to all of its journals, requiring articles' data to be verified in-house to make sure the results are computationally reproducible before publication. In fact, before articles are even accepted, the replication data package needs to be shared with the data editor, and their team is going to be running analyses to make sure results can be verified. So this would actually put the AEA journals at the top guidelines, level 3, which is as good as it can get in the sense that we would assure, hopefully, computational reproducibility. The data editor of the AEA is actually working with some BITS staff on implementation and training around these new standards. This promises to be very influential. In 2005, the AEA adopted a much lighter data sharing policy, but one that at the time was pretty aggressive, just basically asking authors to post replication data when they published a paper in the AER, the American Economic Review. And what you saw immediately there is the AER, articles published in the AER had far more data availability than articles published in other journals. This, since the AER is a flagship journal for our association, many other journals in economics quickly just copied the AER standard. So within a few years, a number of other journals adopted them, and at this point, most, if not all, of the leading journals in economics have at least a basic data sharing requirement. My sense is, given how influential the AEA is, other journals are going to copy this policy too. So this is another positive step forward in economics driven by journal policies. We still have to see the effects of it, but it's quite promising. Okay, so that was number one. There's two more points I want to mention. The second one is I want to discuss the rise of study registration and pre-results review in economics. I think I'm not going to go over these in much detail. There's a lot of reasons intellectually to think that registration of study designs, pre-registration, is very important for meta-analysis, very important for interpreting p-values, very important probably in improving the quality of studies by forcing scholars to really think through what they're doing beforehand. There has been a lot of debate within economics as pre-registration and pre-analysis plans have spread, and I'll show you the data on that in a second. A lot of debate about how detailed the plan should be, whether the costs and the time it takes to write these plans are worth it. And it's really an ongoing debate. There's a well-known paper by Ben Olken on this and others. My own sense about the emerging consensus in economics is pretty optimistic about plans. There's been a lot of discussion about how writing a pre-analysis plan takes time up front. In my own experience, it's true that plans take time to write up front, but there are also time savings on the back end when the data comes in. So it's not as time-consuming as it appears to be up front, and there's tons of other benefits. There's also still active debate in economics about how detailed pre-analysis plans should be. Should they be very sparse, just specifying maybe one or two main outcomes, a main specification, and that's it? Or should they be really detailed takes on what a paper, closer to what the paper will end up being? And again, there's a lot of debate on this in economics. It's unresolved. This is sort of where the field is today. So I'm giving you a snapshot of the field. My own sense is even study registration and even a basic amount of information in the pre-analysis plan is still very useful. It could be useful to have more, but going from no plan and no study registration to at least specifying the primary outcomes, the main statistical approach, and a couple of subgroups that one will focus on. That's a pretty sparse pre-analysis plan, adds a lot of value in terms of accountability. So what does registration look like in economics? The AEA registry was founded in 2013. There are now similar tools in other disciplines. In political science, there's EGAP. There's several different platforms, OSF, as predicted in psychology. I don't know of any similar platform that's widely used in sociology. So that's one social science field that hasn't had the same sorts of changes. What you can see is in this figure is that registration has really taken off in economics. So between May 2013, when it was launched, to 6 years later, not only are there more and more studies being registered, but they're being registered at an increasing pace. So every month, more studies basically are being registered. You have the option, you can either have a pretty sparse, simple registration, a little bit like, I think, how as predicted is. In addition to that, you can post a PDF of a pre-analysis plan that could be much more detailed. Pre-analysis plans are also spreading. So about a third of all registrations have pre-analysis plans, but when I looked at those registered in about the last year, it was over 40%. So more and more scholars in economics are not just registering their studies, they're actually pre-specifying more and more about their analysis over time. And actually, this is a little bit dated. It's from a few months ago. So now there's over 3,000 studies registered on the AEA registry. So there's been a real shift in norms, something that was just, when we started having our first open science meetings 7 or 8 years ago, didn't exist and was sort of a pipe dream to have study registration in economics is really the norm in a lot of subfields. including my own subfield of development economics. So it's still early days. There's been a few years. We really don't have much evidence. There hasn't been enough research on the effect of the registry on economics. I think this will be very welcome research when scholars do it. There's some scholars beginning to do this kind of work. So we don't know for sure whether there are more null results as a result of the registry, or fewer results disappear into the file drawer, et cetera. We can learn something from disciplines with more experience with registries. Of course, everybody knows clinicaltrials.gov has been around for about 20 years now. And there's been a lot of research in medicine about the upsides and downsides and sort of the benefits and failures of clinicaltrials.gov. But to my eye, as an outsider, I think the existence of the registry has proven to be extremely valuable in medicine. Not only can we see when there are deviations from an original analysis plan, we can also get some handle on whether the existence of registration affects the reporting of null results. This isn't a perfect research design if we look pre-post clinicaltrials.gov, but it's at least suggestive and worth thinking about. So, here's a paper published a few years ago, Kaplan and Irvin. These are folks that looked at studies funded by NIH on the effects of particular dietary and nutritional supplements. So again, there's a sort of quality bar these studies meet through NIH funding. These are clinical trials. And what we have here is a vertical line in 2000 when clinicaltrials.gov appears, when it's founded. This new institution is founded. You can see before clinicaltrials.gov, the majority of studies are significant. Those are the little pluses, and very often have really large effect magnitudes, like huge reductions in risk. After 2000, there's this just massive change in the types of results that are published. Lots of zeros, very few significant results, smaller effect sizes. And again, this is just suggestive. Other things could have changed in the year 2000, in that field. But it's quite suggestive that in the long run, study registration may constrain some of the worst forms of publication bias. So this, to me, is encouraging. As a social scientist, we've just brought in registries that the experience in medicine looks quite promising. Okay, another trend or another development that's really promising in this area is the rise of pre-results review. And this is something that until recently didn't even exist in economics, and I'll talk about some progress in this area. In other fields called registered reports. In most fields, I think this article format is called registered reports. When I raised this issue with some colleagues, why don't we, in the last decade or so, why don't we review papers before their results or results blind review? Some colleagues' initial response is, well, how do we do that? How can we judge a paper without seeing the results? And I think an immediate response is we do this all the time. Funding agencies do this all the time. We base funding decisions, whether it's an NSF panel on one end all the way down to grad student travel grants on the other in terms of magnitude of funding, on what we think of as the importance of the question, how good the data is going to be, how feasible it is to execute. So we're already making these calls. And for those that are less familiar with this article format, the idea is that scholars submit a proposal early on, they get it reviewed, and based on the quality of the question, the data, it's given either an in-principle acceptance, a revise and resubmit, or maybe rejected. The authors then collect their end-line data and eventually submit their paper. Now, it's not guaranteed the paper will be published. The authors still need to write it up. They need to interpret the results in a reasonable way based on their findings. And there's the possibility that maybe the end-line data was never collected. So in my field of development economics, many of us have had projects that have fallen apart due to political instability. I had students whose projects in Sierra Leone fell apart due to the Ebola epidemic. Like, your paper won't get published if you can't collect the end line. But as long as you do a reasonable job of interpretation, you have in-principle acceptance. So this is a very different way to review papers. And it's really taken off in psychology and cognitive science, as I think most of you know, in the last few years through the efforts of many people in this room. So this is a figure just showing the number of journals in the left-hand panel that have introduced this article format. So I started discussing this with colleagues. My colleagues at BITS were very interested in this, and we started discussing it with journal editors in economics. We didn't get much interest initially. Through this process, we found out about an instance, a sort of forgotten case, or almost forgotten case in economics, where authors wrote a pre-analysis plan and did pre-results review about 20 years ago. And this is a kind of, I think, like a landmark in social science research that isn't that well known. We talk about it a bit in the book. In the 1990s, during a period in the field of labor economics where there was really heated debate about the impact of minimum wage increases on employment, there were different camps of scholars, some saying, oh, you'd raise the minimum, raising the minimum wage is going to lower employment. Others saying raising the minimum wage isn't, at the levels we're talking about, isn't going to have much of an effect. So there were these different camps. It was very politicized. And the late Alan Kruger, who was at Princeton, had the idea of what was basically a registered report. And he brought this to my colleague at Berkeley, David Levine, who was the editor of a journal called Industrial Relations, who then talked to some of the other players in this literature and said, hey, there are minimum wage increases going on like right now in 1996, 97. The data is going to be released next year. Why don't we write up our plan for how we're going to analyze it before we've seen the data, agree on that, and then publish the results however they turn out? So the idea there was to try to get around all the sort of political bias that may come in, or political pressures that may come in into interpreting data once it's out, by pre-specifying the analysis. Now, it turned out that Alan Kruger ultimately did not participate in this exercise, but David Newmark did. And again, in 1996 and 97, minimum wage increases were taking place. Before data was released, the federal government data was released that they were going to analyze, David Newmark sent his pre-analysis plan to David Levine at the journal, who then got it reviewed by referees, eventually gave it in principle acceptance, and then ultimately published the paper once the data was out and analyzed. So it's an interesting case that actually in this case I think shows a lot of the benefits of pre-results review, keeping authors free of bias from political pressure, in this case in a very high profile setting. So examples like this allowed us to eventually work with colleagues and convince them to launch a pilot of registered reports in economics. And this is something that was launched about a year and a half ago in the Journal of Development Economics. And again, as I mentioned, development economics is my field. It's also a field that was a very early adopter of RCTs, randomized controlled trials, of pre-analysis plans. And especially since pre-analysis plans are so common in development economics, it was a natural place to try out pre-results review under the leadership of Andy Foster and Dean Carlin, and with a lot of support from staff at BITS, Alex Bogdanovsky, Katie Hoberling, and also Fernando Osses, who's here. And my colleagues, together with Andy and Dean, put together materials, FAQs, and other materials for reviewers and authors interested in this article format in the Journal of Development Economics, because it was a new thing. And the way registered reports are implemented in psychology is a little different than economics. Our articles look different. Our articles are a lot longer. We often bring in a lot of secondary data instead of just reporting data from one experiment, and so on. So there were modifications that were necessary to make it feasible to have pre-results review in economics. So far, the pilot has been a success. As of July, there were 46 proposals, first-stage proposals submitted. Now it's over 50. A number of them have already received in-principle acceptance, and there's at least a couple that are getting close to stage 2 acceptance. So this is something that, again, was unknown in economics a year and a half ago that now is increasingly known. A lot of authors have submitted. And in fact, the pilot was seen as so successful that the JDE has now made pre-results review a normal submission track for the journal, a permanent track. And other economics journals are interested in adopting pre-results review. So experimental economics has launched its own pilot. So things are changing in a positive way in terms of pre-results review in economics. Again, we're behind psychology in this, but I do think eventually there'll be quite a lot of support. Okay, let me go to the last bit of my talk, which is about trends in open science. And what I want to do here is present some new data from an unpublished working paper with my co-authors here. They're co-authors at Berkeley, Princeton, MIT, and Garrett is at the Census Bureau now. So this is a new, what we call working paper in economics, or preprint in other fields. Our goal here was to try to gauge all the change we've been talking about. And I think in some of the talks earlier today, some folks here were saying, well, none of our colleagues may even know what we're doing in this room. We're our own community. They don't even know we're doing they may not even know about pre-analysis plans or other things. We wanted to gauge just how attitudes and knowledge are changing among a more representative sample of colleagues. So what we did last year is we ran a survey trying to get a representative samples from two groups. One were authors who had published in influential high-impact factor journals in 4 major social science fields: economics, political science, psychology, and sociology. So we just looked at impact factors, took those 10 journals from each field, and looked at all articles published between 2014 and 2016, and tried to contact a random subset of those authors. We also contacted graduate students in high-profile North American PhD programs, again in these four fields. In all, we tried to reach out to 6,000 both published authors and grad students, and got a response rate of about 46%. So we got almost 3,000 to respond. So clearly not 100%. It's about 50-50 in terms of who responds. If anybody has run surveys where they send out emails and try to get responses, this is a pretty high rate. And it isn't random we got this high rate. We actually incentivized participants. Almost certainly some of you in the room filled in this survey. Some folks were given cash incentives of $60 or $80 to try to get them to participate. So for a sort of realistic research budget, it's not clear how much better we could do than about maybe 50% response rate. I'll talk about the limitations of what we're doing in a second, but we do have a good chunk of active researchers in our sample. And what we see in our data is there's been really rapid adoption of a number of open science practices in the last 10 to 15 years in our data. And let me show you some of the data. So this is a summary of the data. The sample in this figure are published authors, the folks publishing in these sort of top 10 journals based on impact factor in 4 large social science fields. All of these folks got their PhDs in 2007 or earlier. So they should have been research active during this whole period. And what we can see when we look at different practices, if you look at the green line, for now just focus on the solid lines. I'll talk about the shading in a second. If you look at the solid lines, those sharing their data, posting data back in 2005, very few people had posted their data back in 2005. Less than 20%. Today, among these active researchers, it's more like 3/4 have posted research data online. When we look at sharing study instruments, again, very low levels up to about almost half. And pre-registration, again, was unknown in the social sciences until a few years ago, and we start seeing an uptick where now maybe about 1/5 of scholars have pre-registered a study in a few years. Now, what is the shading? I mentioned before we got about half the folks to respond, half didn't respond. What we were able to do among our non-respondents was do some audit activity where we actually went on like data repositories like Dataverse, the AEA registry, and searched the names of a few hundred of our non-respondents to check what behavior we could just directly verify in those registries or data repositories. So when we check in that way, we find somewhat lower data sharing rates, posting of pre-analysis plans, et cetera, among those that we verify, although we could be missing some pre-registrations. They could have pre-registered on a platform we don't know about. We didn't fully search OSF, et cetera. So we see the shaded areas, the bottom of the shaded areas are kind of lower bound once we account for the behavior of the non-respondents, and then the behavior of the respondents is the bar. So, none of the main conclusions really change, even when we take into account that maybe the non-respondents have adopted somewhat fewer practices. Overall, the trends are strongly positive. And they differ a lot by field. So this is the breakdown for these 4 social science fields. Everybody kind of likes to compare their field against somebody else. Economics is in the top left. We've also flagged some institutional or policy innovations like the AEA data policy in 2005 that I mentioned is there on the left. The founding of the later registry is on there. You can see EGAP is on the poli-sci one, COS, and as predicted on psych. There aren't as many high-profile open science platforms in sociology, so we haven't tagged them there. And there are some differences here. Econ and poli-sci look pretty similar. Very rapid increase in data sharing, especially because major journals in those fields in the 2000s pushed for data sharing. But less on other practices, although in recent years in both fields there's been a rise of pre-registration. Psychology is a very interesting case because until about 5 years ago they were behind economics and political science, I think, on all these dimensions. And in the last 5, 6 years, there's been just rapid adoption of data sharing of instruments, and then definitely study registration. So our data suggests that by the end of 2017, 44% of psychologists who were publishing in these journals had pre-registered a study, from 0 a few years before that. That is just rapid change. Sociology has the same sign. There's adoption, but kind of lower levels throughout. So those are the differences across fields. This is my last bit of data, and then I'll wrap up. A lot of the differences across fields, it turns out, as we dive into this data, are driven by research methods. So the panel all the way on the right are scholars across these 4 fields who mainly use theory or do qualitative work. And you can see for those folks, there really is not that much adoption of, say, pre-registration or open data. The middle panel are folks who do quantitative empirical work, but non-experimental. So there's a lot of these folks in economics, political science, people that do secondary data analysis. Here again, you see very high rates of data sharing in the middle panel, but sort of less for sharing of study instruments. They may not be developing their own study materials, and not much pre-registration. And then experimental social scientists across fields really show the fastest adoption of all these practices, especially pre-registration. So experimental social scientists in econ, poli-sci, psych, and sociology, at the end of 2017, over a third had pre-registered a study. And we're planning to go back out in the field. Calling the field. We're planning to send out more surveys later this year, so we'll be able to gauge behavior through the end of 2019. If patterns continue, we could see the majority of experimental social scientists pre-registering, but we'll see what the data looks like. Okay, so let me just wrap up. One last thing on my field, and then I just want to have one last point about culture. Development economics, my own field, again, which was sort of a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of pre-analysis plans, has shown really rapid changes in attitudes towards pre-specification, pre-analysis plans. In our survey, I think there were 70-something development economists in particular in our survey. Over 80% of them support pre-specifying analyses. And again, that was something that was sort of unknown a few years ago. So there's been very rapid cultural change in our community, but as some other folks talked about earlier today, we're going to have to change community by community eventually to achieve things at scale. So just to wrap up, what my goal today was to have a kind of positive, to give you a positive sense of progress in economics and other social sciences, to document using some of the best data that we know of, that norms really are changing. We're in a period where things that were unknown a few years ago are now commonplace in many social science fields with accelerating adoption. So it's a very exciting time and very far away from the world that we knew 6 or 7 years ago when the kind of open social science movement started. There are tools we have in hand that we think can make a difference, particular journal policies. There's more and more evidence of the benefits of open data, et cetera. But the last point I want to make is that, beyond all of this, beyond the tools, beyond the policies, what's so exciting to me about this movement, the Metascience movement, the open science movement, is it's going to help us achieve the cultural change that we need to make these changes permanent. We have to change our mindset as researchers and not focus so much on what people found. The p-value is just one instance of this. Instead of focusing just on what people find, we should focus on what they did. We should focus on the quality of the question, the quality of the data. When we talk to our students and someone says, "Oh, did you see that seminar? How was the paper?" We should say, "It was a really cool paper because it had a great design on an important question with really good data," instead of just saying, "Oh, they had this really significant result on X." So hopefully this movement can not just lead to policy change, but cultural change that makes for new norms that are persistent. Thank you. I don't know if there's any questions or...
Hi, Katie Corker, psychology.
Hey, how are you?
It's very exciting to hear about the success of changes in journal policies at the journals that you're closely associated with. We've had some success with that in psychology, and then other examples where powerful people in positions at journals have not made the same choices. Do you have some speculation on why it was so successful in the top economic journals?
Well, to be honest, I've really highlighted the successes, but there's success and failure in econ too. And I think In the book and in some review pieces, we've kind of given a little bit more of the panorama. I think some of the changes are very recent. I think till quite recently, we were very frustrated with journals in econ, and maybe that mirrors some of the experience in psychology. The change in terms of pre-results review at the JDE and now experimental economics and other journals is really just something that's come about in the last couple of years. And until then, when it was taking off in psychology, and I remember attending a meeting at Center for Open Science where there was so much energy around pre-results review, registered reports in psychology, and I sent out a number of emails and made a bunch of phone calls following that meeting. This is the 2015 meeting that led to the top guidelines, or 2014. And was kind of, myself and other BITS folks were just sort of rebuffed by all the journals. So I think it's taken time, but now we're getting some traction. So I think all fields may be kind of experiencing similar things. The AEA for us is very influential, and you may have similar societies or associations in psychology, but the fact that the AEA now has leadership that's pushing for these changes, I think will really help transform economics. The AEA journals are some of the best cited journals in econ. There's one figure, I didn't mention it, but I can mention, who ties some of this together. People may know the name Ben Bernanke, the former head of the Federal Reserve. So Ben Bernanke was a professor at Princeton, or is back at Princeton now. When he was the head of the AER in 2005, he pushed for the open data policy. And he's the president of the AEA now, and he's pushing the data policy. So it's very kind of idiosyncratic. And certain influential individuals can push through changes. So we're happy that we're making progress, but it will take years. And I think in that way, probably there's a lot in common with psychology.
Hi. So I do, it was a really great talk.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. I do research on publication bias in clinical research, where, as you mentioned with clinicaltrials.gov, it's a lot more developed, the idea of pre-registration, prospective registration and reporting, but yet we still know that quite a bit of publication bias happens out there in the world, even when it's required by law, to register, which isn't happening in any other field pretty much. Do you, and I know you were trying to focus on the positive and the progress in your presentation, but do you have a sense in what the status of publication bias looked like in the field? Was there any sort of efforts to uncover what that looked like at a baseline, and then to see how things like pre-registration might be improving that?
In economics, I mean.
Yes, in economics.
Yeah, there have been several pretty high-profile recent papers, which are similar to studies that have been found in other fields, trying to document the extent of publication bias in econ. And it's severe. I mean, I think as in many other fields. So I think the baseline isn't great. The baseline is there's a ton of publication bias. There's estimates floating around by a couple of econometricians that the likelihood, if you compare the likelihood a null result is published versus a significant result, that a statistically significant result is between 3 to 30 times more likely to be published. And this is actually, I saw Max here before. I don't know if Max is still, so that's Max's paper who's sitting right there. So this is Isaiah Andrews and Max Casey, who have a beautiful paper in the American Economic Review on this. And I think that's where we're starting from. So they've given us the sort of latest evidence from economics. So we have a long way to go. And I think the hope is now that we have registration, we can start seeing whether that changes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right. Aside from the randomized control trials that happen in economics, a lot of it is based on sort of archival data that's already been collected.
Yeah.
Has economics grappled with how to do a pre-registration? Is it, because an honor system seems to be, I haven't already ran this model, but maybe that's not warranted. How has econ dealt with this?
I think that's one of the central questions that we face, because the majority of papers in econ, same in poli-sci, as I think earlier authors alluded to, are observational. They're not experimental. We can't run experiments on a lot of the things that we care about. So I think the estimate is something like 80% of papers are observational, non-experimental. There are some ways forward with pre-registration, even for observational research. For instance, in cases like the minimum wage case that I talked about before, where the data has not yet been released, or the policy change has not yet happened, or the election has not yet happened, one could imagine in that sort of prospective case writing a very detailed pre-analysis plan as you would for an experiment. You can't data mine election results if the election hasn't happened yet. So I think there is a way forward for some, like a very direct way forward for some types of observational research, but for others I think it's been more challenging to find the solution. And I think in economics we're going step by step. We haven't kind of gotten there yet. Yeah.
Scientific knowledge engineering. You highlight. Thank you for the optimism of your talk. I think it's just great to see positive trend, but also just to kind of hear in a fairly well described way exactly what the basis for optimism is. And I was wondering about the role of technology in this whole process. It doesn't seem to me, listening to you, that there is a great impact of all of the significant developments in AI or computational infrastructure. I mean, one of your slides mentions the arrival of the Center of Open Science as a notable event, but no mention was made of, for example, scientific workflows and architectures that people use for reproducibility in other areas. And I'm just curious, it's like, is that significant? Should we, as technologists and developers and computer scientists, should we, what is our role in terms of providing tools and systems and ontologies and representations and these things in the underlying positive trend? Is our work relevant?
Yeah, thanks for that question. There's a number of ways in which data science, computer science, machine learning are affecting the social sciences and economics. And I didn't get into them here, but I think they are important. So I'll mention two just briefly, which is this goal of achieving computational reproducibility is obviously very important. We want to be able to make sure published results are reproducible. In that quest, data science methods have been very important. So an increasing number of economists and other social scientists are using version control approaches that were pioneered in data science or computer science. And that's something that's becoming common in, say, BITS training courses. Certainly COS is a technology organization as much as anything. There's been a lot of emphasis on those data science tools. So that's one piece. Beyond computational reproducibility, there's increasing interest and awareness in machine learning tools, and they could be used in pretty interesting ways, say in pre-analysis plans. And again, I didn't get into it here, but a number of economists and data scientists are collaborating on ways we can be pre-specifying, not necessarily exactly our statistical model, but maybe the machine learning approach we'll use to choose the right statistical model. So there is sophisticated thinking along these lines. I think those collaborations are still nascent, but they're starting to make a mark on the field.
Thank you.
Yeah. One more? Okay.
Hi, Leif
Leif.
from Berkeley. Thanks for the nice talk, Ted, and for your optimism, and honestly, for creating all of those good things. You get a lot of credit for it. I'm going to ask, it's a relatively narrow question, but I think you're the right person to ask. So registered reports are clearly great, that journals should offer them. That sounds unassailable. Do you also recommend that all published work should be in that form? And here I'm mostly thinking from the domain of experimental psychology. Our typical papers have many, many studies, and it seems the registered report format would involve a decade-long exchange with reviewers that would make the reviewers hate the process, make the authors hate the process, and make no one read the paper. And so but do you think that it is worth it to make that sort of normative?
I don't advocate that, and I think when you think about a field like mine in economics, there's such a variety of different types of empirical work and theoretical work, some of which may be straightforward to apply a registered report format or write pre-analysis plans for certain types of studies and not others. So I don't advocate that personally, and I think we can learn a lot from stuff that's not pre-specified. I've said that from the beginning. We just want to know what is and what isn't pre-specified. We want to know what's exploratory and what's confirmatory. And we're going to learn a lot even beyond what's pre-specified. So I think the JDE has gotten a bunch of submissions, but they have no plan to abandon their kind of usual format. And I think that's a good thing. I think it would be a mistake for us to sort of like rule out other types of research at this point. But yeah. Thanks.